So Walter Parks and Laurie McDonald, who are Hollywood producers who usually do features, they ran DreamWorks for 9 years, pursued the life rights to her story for a movie. And they had the early printing of the book, and they were the ones who got the life rights. And they went to meet with her. And once they sat down with Malala, they immediately said, "This can't be a movie. You know, who would play her?" So they said it must be a documentary. And when they came home from meeting her in Birmingham, England, they called me, and because we had met socially, but and they asked me, and I was like, "Well, so what would you be interested?" And I said, "Well, let me read," because I sort of knew the headlines of her story. And I think what's special about this movie is that people think they know who she is. She's a girl who was shot on a school bus, but they don't know the rich, epic quality of her story. And that's what was interesting to me, that there was so much more to her story than what we think we know. And it's in the title. The title of the movie is He Named Me Malala, and it's supposed to have some mystery to it as to why is the movie named that, and what is why is that so important? She's named after a girl, like a Joan of Arc character in Pashtun lore, a girl who rallied the Afghan army who was retreating from the British. She was a nurse, and she rallied the Afghan army to defeat the British heroically. But the girl leads them in a charge and is killed. And the way she leads them is speaking out and saying, it's better to live like a lion for one day than a slave for 100 years. And it has sort of an epic quality to it, because Malala is named after this girl who speaks out and is killed for speaking out. And Malala speaks out. As a young girl, she speaks out against the Taliban and is almost killed for speaking out. And so you say, wait a minute, well, how did that happen? And you couldn't have written it in a Hollywood movie. And so to me, that's sort of the framework for the question of what is the nature of her greatness? What is the nature of this girl? Just that she's so forgiving. That seems like such a mushy word, but it's not mushy when you're with her, because it's true forgiveness. Sometimes we toss that word around, and we tell our children to forgive one another, but she lives a life without any bitterness, without any anger. And I'm in a world in LA where, if you get your cold pressed coffee delivered to you the wrong way, you've had the worst day ever. It's like, well, how was your day? Oh, it was terrible. She was shot on her school bus. She's been, she lives in exile from her home. She can't go home. Her father can't do what he loves to do, which is to teach. And yet they live a truly forgiving life without any bitterness or anger. And to me, that's very inspiring. I mean, there was work and travel and all sorts of logistics, which were very difficult. But this is the hardest movie I've ever made for other reasons. It was a very hard story structure to put together. And for a very long time, the movie didn't work. So I like to do a cut and show it to people. And I would think it would work, and then it wouldn't work, and I'd go home and I was miserable, because it was like, because the story is so moving to me, and I wasn't getting it right. The story structure is nonlinear, so it cuts back and forth between before she was shot and after she was shot. And that's nonlinear is very hard to do. But I've done nonlinear before. But, how do you get the tone right between these two very different storylines of the Taliban coming into this small village, and then her life now in Birmingham in the West? And so it was very, very difficult. And there was to ask my wife, and she say, I was despairing the fact that I could not figure this out. And maybe I would never get it right. I had great editors, Greg Finton and Brad Fuller in particular, who, carried me through it, and a series of breakthroughs, none of which are all that interesting. But sometimes it's simplifying things. I mean, I really learned that the story should build towards a simple choice of her deciding to speak out and her father deciding to let her, to risk her life to speak out. At the core of it, this movie is not about being shot on a school bus, but about the choice to speak out. Well, it was so different from other people I've done movies about, because I think in this time, I think in the 60s and 70s, you could put a camera on your shoulder and go into someone's life and people would just trust you and be more open. Now I think people are so self-conscious because we see so much reality television. We're the keepers of our own story because we're on Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. I'm not, but and so we're conscious of how we're being seen. Malala and her father aren't that way. And as much as they are public figures and as much as they tell their own story, they have, from the very beginning, when they were completely unknown, telling their story was not an act of vanity or self-promotion. Their act of telling their story was to try to get the world to understand what they were going through, and they needed help. And so the minute we started the conversation, I felt their openness, and I think they understood that I was helping them tell their own story. So when you see the movie, it feels like they're narrating it. I mean, most of the movie is Zia, Dean, and Malala telling us their story, and those come from these very simple interviews that are very personal. Well, there's sort of two things, and my movies are sort of a balancing act between this sort of bigger cause, like climate change or public education. But I like those sort of bigger missions to sit outside the actual experience of watching the movie. I hope that people go off and do these incredible things. I hope people support Malala and her mission and the Malala Fund. But at the core, my movies are about something more simple. In this case, it's the act of finding your voice and speaking out that I think appeals to me, because I have two daughters who often don't feel like their voice is relevant. So my hope is that girls everywhere feel like it's their movie. That girls, especially boys too, but girls see that if an ordinary girl in Pakistan can speak out for what she believes, that they can do that too.